Some of you, maybe most of you, are familiar with this image or images similar to it. This was back in August 2020 at the port of Lebanon, of Beirut, when over 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded, the reason for which is still unknown to this day. This catastrophic explosion, which was reported at the time as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, completely ravaged many neighborhoods in the capital, killing over 270 people, injuring and maiming over 6,000 people, and displacing 300,000 people. As with most catastrophic and spectacular events that take place in Lebanon, this was followed by a series of demonstrations. This took place on August 8th, when tens of thousands of people took to the street to denounce what was understood at the time as catastrophic mismanagement, as negligence, criminal negligence. There was an outpouring of rage, of anger that was directed at all political parties in Lebanon, and in particular at the government that was in control at the time. Almost 4 years later, the family members of the victims still demonstrate every 4th of the month, every year on the anniversary, demanding justice, demanding some form of accountability, demanding some form of restitution, and to date, nobody has been held accountable, nobody has been held responsible, and it is most likely that nobody will ever be brought to justice. So this brings us to the public source and the story that we worked on the 2-year anniversary of the Beirut explosion. We worked on a 2-part investigative feature. The first one was titled "The Ecological Time Bombs Unloaded at the Beirut port decades ago." So on the first anniversary of the Beirut explosion, we, like most other independent and state-affiliated and politically affiliated media outlets in the country, reported extensively on the explosion. At the public source, we reported from the framework of disability justice. We talked about housing rights. We talked about the rights of migrant workers who had been injured. We, in the first special issue that we published on the first anniversary, we tackled the Beirut explosion from every angle that we possibly could. And here we were 2 years after the explosion, and we wrestled with the question of how do we try to do some form of justice to the victims of this explosion? How can we look at the story from a different angle? How can we do anything that might make some kind of difference? So we went back in history a little bit, back to the late 1980s. This was in 87, 89, when there was a very similar story that had taken place at the time. In 87, 89, those were the twilight years towards the end of the Lebanese civil war that had lasted 15 years. And there were a lot of strange parallels between these two stories. Both involved a ship being brought into the port of Beirut, carrying toxic material, causing a lot of harm. In this case of the ship that was brought towards the end of the 80s, it contained also over 2,000 tons of toxic material that was imported by a Lebanese militia at the time called the Lebanese Forces, that is now a political party with representation in parliament. So they had brought this shipment from the Italian mafia that at the time had paid them $22 million. And it was brought in these blue barrels that were eventually dispersed and hidden and camouflaged in the mountains in different parts outside of the city. People were not aware what was contained, what was in these in these barrels. Some people used these barrels to store different kinds of food or olives. Some of them used to store water in them. So for many, many decades, people were using these barrels. People were not even aware what these barrels initially contained. They were leaching into the soil, into the water, poisoning people very slowly, very gradually. And nobody had any idea of the consequences to their health. So at the Public Source, we are big fans of looking at the history of our country and history in general to understand our present moment in order for us to be able to shape the future in some form or another. So we went back to the story of these ecological time bombs as they were referred to by a Greenpeace report at the time, in order for this story to serve as a cautionary tale of how the judiciary at the time played an essential role in the cover-up, how the government also tried to cover up the story, how the perpetrators got away. And again, we saw a lot of similarities between what was happening during the investigation into the Beirut port explosion in 2020 and this story from over 37 years ago. This was the second part of the series titled Merchants of Death. This was one of the scientists who was commissioned alongside a handful of other scientists to investigate these toxic barrels. Eventually, he became prosecuted, assaulted, attacked, harassed, him and the other scientists, the journalists also who were looking into this case. So everybody who was trying to hold this political faction at the time, this political militia responsible, ended up facing the consequences as opposed to the actual perpetrators of this grave environmental crime. So what's really interesting for us is that this investigative feature did not uncover anything that was novel, anything that was not already known to the public. This was an already very well-established case. Our reporting relied extensively on archives of Safir, a prominent newspaper at the time, other archives, and on the research of these three scientists. But by doing so, by uncovering what was widely assumed as a dead case, as a case that nobody had any interest in reviving, that was long forgotten, so much so that when my neighbor heard about the summons that was brought against us by the Cybercrime Bureau, he kind of laughed at me and he said, "This is a story that is really old, everybody knows of it, we know all the details, so why are you wasting your time reporting or talking about a story and a dead case? Nobody cares, nobody cared at the time, and nobody's going to care today." But some people were very upset, in particular this political party. We published this piece, and frankly, some of our material, because it's so long, it's so dense, it's very heavy, don't have a large reading, or we don't have a very large following because of the kind of material that we published. So 8 months later, we had almost forgotten about the story. We had moved on to other pieces. And then 8 months later, I get a call summoning me for an investigation interrogation by the Cybercrime Bureau, because this was considered a cybercrime. And it was brought on behalf of the Lebanese forces. After some deliberations with my colleagues, with the lawyer, we eventually decided that I would not show up for an investigation. Instead, what we did was we held a solidarity rally. We distributed this cool little poster that our comic artist designed, which is, I'm sure most of you know, a riff on the IWW's United, We Bargain, Divided, We Beg. So we played on that, and here ours was titled United We Interrogate, Divided We're Interrogated. So on the day of the investigation, we had about 60, 70 people show up at the Cybercrime Bureau, and I refused to go in, so we just stayed outside for a while as the lawyer was sharing with the officers our rejection of their interrogation, which was illegal. Journalists in Lebanon, media workers in Lebanon have a different court in which they're supposed to be judged or investigated with. So on that basis, we refused the investigation. We made some noise. This was widely covered, widely reported on by a lot of local and even international news outlets. And this is just one shot of the little solidarity rally that was held outside of the Cybercrime Bureau. So that's a brief recap of what happened. This was last year in April of 2023. And looking back at it now, it was really a fun moment in comparison to what is happening to Palestinian and Lebanese journalists today. Despite the repression that we often face in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region, but as media workers in general, it is absolutely nothing in comparison to what Palestinian and Lebanese journalists are going through today. These are just 9 of 12 colleagues who were recently killed by the Israeli army. For the majority of journalists who are being killed, they were intentionally targeted. The last 2 journalists who were killed were targeted in their sleep in a compound full of journalists with the full knowledge of the Israeli military, that they were there with full notice, that there were several local and international media organizations stationed at this particular compound, and nonetheless, they were targeted and 2 of them were martyred. And the case is, of course, much, much worse for our Palestinian colleagues in Gaza. Over 175 of them have been deliberately targeted by the Israeli occupation. Not only are they being targeted, but their families are as well. They're under intense, immense pressure, facing threats by the Israeli occupation on a regular basis. And I just want to highlight the case of these 2 Palestinian journalists and their response to the assassination threats that they have been facing over the past 2 weeks. One of them is Anas al-Sharif, and the other one is Ashraf Saraj. Both of them work for Al Jazeera. Shortly after these threats came out, Anas said on social media, "Decree whatever you are to decree, our coverage goes on." Ashraf spoke about the accusations that are being made against them, and these are accusations that all Palestinians and all Lebanese people face of being terrorists as a pretext to assassinate people, to target journalists. And it's not just journalists who are being targeted. It's aid workers, it's doctors, it's university professors, it's children, it's toddlers, it's babies, it's pregnant women. Nobody is unscathed by the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and now that has expanded to Lebanon. Sorry for the brief deviation, but it felt necessary and urgent to talk about our Palestinian colleagues and the absolute horror that they have been living through for over the past 14 months. That's it for me. If you'd like to get in touch, that's my email and that's my Twitter account. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Lara. We'll take questions at the end. Next up, we have all the way from Marseille, I think, Ariane Lavrilleux from Disclose, which is a great newish, I mean, not that new really, but a French investigative outfit which has long been a friend of Symposium. Ariane's going to talk about her investigation into the DGSI, which is France's equivalent of MI5, and its murderous complicity with the Egyptian authorities in a campaign to track down and kill smugglers. Ariane.
Hello. I completely agree with what my colleague said, Lara, Bitar. I wouldn't be there today and in my career if they were not Palestinian Egyptian journalists who were brave enough to report on war crimes. So what she said was very important, and I really abide by. So I'm going to speak about Disclose, which is indeed a kind of a new outlet, 5 years. We publish investigation in partnership with local, European, and international media. And in 2021, we published a series of articles and TV documentary about a secret Egyptian-French military operation involved in killing civilians, hundreds of civilians. It's called Egypt Papers. At that time, I was a freelance journalist based in Cairo, and Disclose asked me to join their team on this investigation. I left Egypt a few months before we published it in order to avoid prison. 2 years later, in September 2023, so last year, I was placed in custody, and French intelligence service searched my flat. So all this happened in Marseille, in France. But before digging into the consequences, sad consequences of this story, I want to ask you a question about the public interest of the story that we published, because apparently there is a disagreement with the French state and us journalists. So I want you to imagine yourself as editors. I know that there's already some editors in the room. So for a few minutes, you're going to be editor. Imagine that Disclose is coming to you, and the editor-in-chief is actually in the room and is telling you, okay, we have a leak on crimes against humanity, and we want to publish it with you. I'm going to show you a short teaser that sum up the story. So are you on board? Do you think it's a public interest story?
September 21st, 2016. Somewhere in western Egypt, an Egyptian military aircraft flies over the desert. A few minutes later, bombs are dropped over civilians. A summary execution, carried out with the help of the French government. Disclose has obtained hundreds of classified documents from the highest sources in the state. Reports from the French presidency, from the Military Intelligence Directorate, and from the Ministry of Defense. This unprecedented leak sheds light on a secret and ongoing intelligence operation in Egypt. Its codename, Syria. Its mission, monitoring the western Egyptian desert all the way to the Libyan border. Begun in 2016 with the objective of countering terrorism, this military cooperation will in fact allow for the bombing of hundreds of civilians. The French presidency has been repeatedly notified of these state crimes. July 3rd.
So just to make it clear, because it's still a bit early in the morning, the French didn't bomb random people in the desert. It's the Egyptian army who did with French intelligence. French were giving the location of potential smugglers, and then F-16 were taking off and drop bombs on those people without prior notice, which is extrajudicial killings. So among you, can you raise your hand if you think it's a public interest and you would be interested to publish with us? oh, wow, I have a full room of crazy people, great. This is very important, so you need to listen carefully what I'm going to say, because you are about to commit an offense, a serious offense under French law. We are about to publish the biggest leak of classified document in the French modern history. And this is an offense that could put you in jail up to 5 years. And you could be convicted of a fine of 75,000 euros, which is a fourth of disclosed revenue. We decided to take that risk, and we published the information, and we sum up the main story in a website called Egypt Paper. But we published the document on Document Cloud, a copy of the document. We redacted all the name of the soldiers, but we kept the name of the president, the ministers, the leaders in charge of this operation. So we had that risk of prison and being prosecuted. French public TV at that time was keen to take that risk. And you have to know also that even if you don't publish the story, but if you are aware of this information, classified information, is the same sentence. You are risking 5 years of jail under French law. So there's not many cases like that in France that happened. There is only one guy that has been sued, arrested before me. He wrote a book about French intelligence operation, how they fail, how they succeed, and now is being indicted, and he will be probably a judge in next year. So what happened exactly to me in 2021? This risk of 5 years of prison and being prosecuted was a bit theoretical, because no other journalist has been really detained. Usually in France, journalists are summoned by the police for a few hours and they are released. But me, what happened is that I had 9 intelligence officers knocking at my door at 6 a.m. in the morning with their bulletproof vests, their guns. They raided my flat. They were pretty polite. They didn't uncuff me, but that's it. No internet, no phone. And a judge also was there in my house, and she told me, well, give us the document, give us the information we are looking for. It's going to be quicker. Well, first, the documents are online. It's not a secret anymore. And we are several journalists who signed the article. We are 4 journalists. We are not hiding. We were not anonymous journalists. And second, there is a law on protection of journalistic sources. In fact, in France, you must know that authorities can break the law on the protection of journalistic sources if a judge estimates that there is a so-called overriding public interest. So you might complain later to the European Court, but it's too late. They already invaded your newsroom and your home. And MP were very smart, so they did not define what is an overriding public interest. So basically, it could be talking about anything the state doesn't want you to talk about, which is one of the definitions of journalism. So they can legally spy on you, they can follow your phone, follow your family, your friend. This is what happened to me and to other journalists. I had at least 6 intelligence officers following me for months before they came to me and detained me. In my flat, when they were in my flat, the officer opened my computer, and they use spying tool, the Israeli spying tool, Celebrite. They plugged it onto my hardware, my phone. They extracted all data. They analyzed it with keywords. After 10 hours of searching everywhere, they chose not to take my tools. They leave it in my home, but they took me in detention for 2 days in an underground cell in Marseille. It was not very comfortable, no blankets, no pretty cold, no medication, although I was sick. I assumed the idea was to weaken me in order for me to speak. Happily, I had some friends and unions gathering outside of the police station, a bit like in Beirut, and it was very comforting to hear people clapping while I was being interrogated by DGSE, so the French intelligence officer. I want to conclude with a good news, because we receive a good news from the European Court of Human Rights. This is just off the record because we just received it and we didn't publish yet the story, so I assume it's a safe place. We just learned that they accepted, the European Court accepted a complaint of NGOs, American Egyptian NGO, who tried to ask repeatedly French judicial system to investigate the crime that we revealed. And the possible complicity of the French army. But all the French refused to investigate, so the European Court will open a case against France. But it doesn't mean that Disclose and I are free of charges, not at all. Actually, the case is still open. The judge can decide at any time to interrogate my colleagues, to raid our newsroom. I might be indicted. We have a constant threat above our head. I see your faces. Please don't feel sorry. You did nothing wrong, but you can do something great to help us, to support us, because the only reason we won't fall, and we didn't fall yet, it's because we had tremendous support from human rights activists, and in particular from Egypt and the Arab world, and from unions, European unions. So if you want to support us, just follow us on the social network, subscribe to our free newsletter. This is French. It's in French. This is a great opportunity to learn French. And maybe we'll have an English newsletter soon. You can also, if you can also donate, because it's a non-profit newsroom and that relies on philanthropic and private donation. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Ariane. Next up, we have Nikolas Leontopoulous, all the way from Athens, longtime friend of the symposium, and part of a collective of reporters called Reporters United. Now, we knew that Nikolas was doing some great work over there in Athens, but we were as surprised as everybody else when we heard about his fantastic story. About a surveillance scandal which implicated the Greek political establishment. Nikolas, over to you.
Can you hear me? Yes. So I'm Nikolas from Greece. We are a small project called Reporters United. I will say a few things about Reporters United, but starting by correcting James, in the sense that I am going to talk to you about what is, in our opinion, a huge story about surveillance in Greece, but a story that goes far beyond Greece. It's an international story. The only point where I have to correct you is that it's not my story, it's not even a Reporters United story. And the contradiction in what I'm about to say is that my main point in the presentation is about silence and solitude, the feeling of journalists working on a story alone and their frustration when there is across-the-board silence, that it can be political silence, institutional silence, media silence, and so on. But on the positive side of things, we are not alone. There is right now in Greece a flourishing scene of investigative journalists and of new investigative independent projects. There is not just Reporters United, there is Solomon, there is the Manifold, there is MIR, who are all non-profit projects. And of course, there are also great colleagues from for-profit projects. For example, in the surveillance story that I'm about to narrate, telling again about silence, the interesting thing is that this is a story that was pursued without us knowing about them and them knowing about us by Reporters United and another small investigative outlet called Inside Story. And I was working with my very young colleague Thodoris Chondrogianos. They are working Inside Story. It was Tassos Telou and Lexé Triantafylou. And I'm saying the names because it's kind of interesting that we're starting on working on the story without knowing each other. We are friends. We were competitors. We were publishing on a Monday. They would do a big scoop on a Monday. We would be dead because of their scoop, and 3 days later we would do something else and so on. But the scene in Greece right now is very vibrant when it comes to investigative journalism. So our project is Reporters United. It's very small. It is trying to be fiercely independent in the sense that we have a very strict funding policy that we do not take money from the Greek state. We do not take money from foreign governments. We are very eclectic with money from foundations. So we're trying to exclude money in Greece and outside Greece that comes from foundations that dominate public life because we think that's a problem. And actually, I'm very grateful to the symposium that tomorrow we are going to have the discussion on the CIA. I mean, it's a joke, but still on journalism and funding and independence. The last thing we did in Greece is launching a whistleblowers platform that is called GreekLeaks. Then also to give credit to partners, this is the page by the FPF, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, that has built Secure Drop, and I'm very happy that in their first page are promoting, they have all those huge media, like the Washington Post and Spiegel, etc. And two of the projects that are on the panel are promoted in their first page. It's Disclose and GreekLeaks by Reporters United. So I start with one of our publications that shows this picture to show that it's not a local story. This is the so-called Predator Files scandal. It's about an international company called Intellexa that has been active in jurisdictions all over the world and doing exports of surveillance equipment all over the world, but actually in Europe, because they need to have the export license to be able to export their stuff, they had a great friendly connection to the Greek government, so they used Greece in order to be able to do export licenses and to export surveillance stuff to places with huge human rights problems like Madagascar, Sudan, and so on. This is Tal Dilian. He's the businessman, the Israeli businessman founder of the group. In the middle, there is our Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who, in our opinion, and we are paying a price for saying this, was hugely involved in the scandal. And this is also Emmanuel Macron, to give an international dimension of the project, because we worked in a consortium with international media, with IKE, which is a cross-border collaboration with Spiegel and Mediapart, etc. And we were able to show also a responsibility in places like France. Just to give a little bit of context about surveillance, this is a graph that shows number of wiretaps, of legal wiretaps per year in Greece on national security grounds. So if you see, it starts at very low, around 400 wiretaps per year in, what is the date? I cannot see. It's 2005, I think. And by 2021, Greece is issuing the prosecutors that are embedded in the, let's say, Greek spying service are issuing more than 15,000 wiretaps against persons that are based in Greece on grounds of national security, which, in my view, it's an insane number that year by year you have 15,000 official, hidden, of course, secret, wiretaps on national security. Now, the word national security might seem very serious to you, but actually it's a complete joke, because what they do is that they pretend that the person that they want to follow to survey electronically is a danger for the national security of the country, but the reason they do that is that if they label that person as a national security risk, then they don't have to say who that person is. So this will sound all Greek to you, but it's one of the documents that we were able to reveal. Actually, it's an older document. I will talk about documents later on because it's a legal issue. But you can see that this is like the paper that the spying service is sending to the prosecutor, and then the prosecutor just sees it, stamps it, and then it starts. And the prosecutor only sees a phone number, so they don't know whose phone number is it. And because it's για λόγους εθνικής ασφάλειας, which means for grounds of national security, they don't need to explain why they are doing the surveillance. And then they go to their telecom operators, they have a legal agreement with them, and the telecom operators open the ports, etc., and they're able to do the surveillance. So for me, already this was information known in Greece before the scandal started. And that's why I'm talking about silence, because for me, this should be a huge story in such a small country when you have 15,000 legal interceptions per year, and it was not. It became a big story because us, journalists, with our colleagues from other also media, we were able to reveal who they were also surveying. And it became massive because we started by revealing that it was journalists. For example, I will show this journalist over there on your left side, as you see, it's Thanasis Koukakis, financial reporter, working on a financial story labeled by the state national security risk, I do not understand why, surveyed both by Predator, which is the illegal spyware, and by the Greek National National Intelligence Service. So the Greek government's response to that was that it's a coincidence. We published the papers, the documents, showing that he was under surveillance by the Greek state, and Inside Story, the other outlet, published evidence that his phone was tapped with Predator software. This happened the exact same time. The Greek government was saying this is a coincidence and so on. But it wasn't just journalists. Gradually, the story became a big story, and we realized that the Greek government was, I believe, and we have written about that, the Prime Minister's office was involved in a massive spyware operation with Intellexa, the Israeli company, spying on journalists, the biggest publisher, media publisher in Greece, the biggest generals of the Greek army, chief of staff and high-ranking officials, etc., the high-ranking officials of the police, and even on their own friends and on their own government. Some of the most influential people in the Prime Minister's office were being spied. Some of the top ministers, Minister of Economy, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so on, Homeland Security and all that, they were also spied. And for me, what is interesting, and it's like a spoiler, is that we've been 3 years in that, trying to write and report and, confront and being confronted and all that. And 3 years later, there hasn't been one government official that has paid any price for that, like being prosecuted, being indicted, and so on. It's only us journalists that are paying the price. We are dragged all the time in courts. And to give you the general context, we are a project with an annual budget of 150,000 euros, and we are now facing slap lawsuits for more than 4 million euros. And it becomes a pattern, because once they see that it works, then, for example, we do a story on a big hotel resort in Greece, on a big ship company in Greece, and again, there is a slap notice. First a legal notice, then a lawsuit, and so on. But my point was silence. And I want to make a bigger point of that. Of course, we cannot compare with the kind of challenges that my colleagues in Beirut, Lara and Ariane, have been facing in Lebanon and France. But before going to the attacks, I want to talk about silence. So the story starts in 2021 when a minor legislative amendment is passed in the parliament during midnight session, nobody knows, etc. And it's a very important legal amendment because it changed the way how much information the state can give to the people who are under surveillance. Nobody notices, but there are three very important people in the whole story who make a big case about that. They publish a big article in the let's say, academic press about legal scholars and all that. And at that point, the secret stops being a secret. More and more people know about that in Greece. So a big publisher, the biggest publisher in Greece, goes to the prime minister and he tells him, you cannot do that. This makes us look like Russia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. I'm not just naming the countries. Those are three countries that were condemned in the Strasbourg Human Rights Court, especially because of changing this law in the same way like Greece did. My point here is that there is a year that goes by with important people of the Greek political and media establishment knowing about the change in the law, and there is nothing in the press. Absolutely nothing. Nobody writes about that. They know, they do nothing. Going forward, January 22, we learn about the legal amendment. We know that something is happening. We are trying to understand why they did it, what kind of traces they were able to, they were trying to hide. We publish the story. We have the prime minister on the cover. Somebody would say it's a little bit sensational because we do not know whether he's involved, but he's in charge of the spy service in Greece. This was his first decision when he took office in 2019. He made himself responsible for the spying service. Then, if the first period of silence, we would call it, let's say, the silence, okay, it's a little bit populist, but let's say the silence of the elites because they knew and they did nothing. The second period of silence is when Reporters United, our project, and Inside Story, the other investigative project in Greece, start doing a series of reports on that. We reveal the surveillance of Thanasis Koukakis. We start doing investigative stories on one of the most powerful people in Greece, who is the General Secretary of the Prime Minister and his nephew, a person that at least until that moment was completely untouchable by anybody, trying to connect the dots and his ties to the businessman who brought Predator in Greece. But for 8 months, nobody again notices, nobody cares, no mainstream medium publishes these investigations. In fact, when we publish state documents, an investigation starts, but it's not about the surveillance of a journalist, it's about the leak of the documents. We reach August 2022, it's our big story, we are able at last to connect the Prime Minister's nephew with the whole network of the companies, etc. We are lucky because at the same day it is being revealed by himself, by the leader of the opposition, that his phone was tapped with Predator. Next day, big political crisis. Our guy, Dimitriadis, the nephew of the prime minister, has to quit. Suddenly, the story becomes, of course, a big story about mainstream press. And then comes the third round of silence, which I would call it an institutional silence, a complete cover-up from judicial authorities about everything that has to do with the story. As I told you, 3 years later, no indictments, no nothing. He sues us, our first lawsuit, for, I think, 500,000 euros. Starts a story of attacks. We have evidence that journalists in our project, my colleague Thodoris, but also in the other project, Stasos Telegu and Elisa Triantafylou, are being surveyed. We have a very important report by Kathimerini, which is a paper of reference in Greece that reveals that the police actually issues orders to policemen in the center of Athens to follow in a physical way journalists in the center of Athens, which is a little bit surreal that they do not just do electronic surveillance, but they follow us in the middle of the street when we are trying to do our reporting. But it's all about the key word of the symposium. It's all about sources. Their biggest concern was not what we are doing. Their biggest concern was who we were talking to. And actually, after this happens, a very serious development happens. The Supreme Court prosecutor of Greece, the highest prosecutor you can have in the country, who is put in his position by the government, starts a criminal investigation against potential sources of our investigation, trying to prosecute the people that they were suspecting that they were the source. We even have a very silly spear phishing. I don't know if in the room you know what spear phishing is. I didn't. Spear phishing attempt while we are ready to go on court for our first lawsuit, and we were in panic mode because we are very small and the opponent is very big, etc. They create a fake website with a fake journalist sending us fake questions and also leaking our tax data in public, just to intimidate us, to show that they know, and also to a little bit destabilize us 3 days before we go on trial against the big guy. Anyway, that's a nice day. It's 24 January 2024. This is a picture outside the courtroom in Athens. This is not just Reporters United. This is journalists from across the board and from the other investigative projects that I talked about that are there to celebrate. And actually, a few weeks ago, we won this first lawsuit. And actually, it's a very big victory for us that we won against one of the most powerful people in Greece. Last thing, and I'm done, but it has a little bit of London interest. That's why I sneaked it in the... So these three people are celebrities in Greece because they are at the same time media owners and football owners and huge ship owners. They are among the biggest ship owners in the world. If you follow football, maybe you know the guy in the middle. I'm really curious as if anybody in the room follows. So this guy in the middle, he's called Marinakis. He's one of the biggest ship owners in the world. He owns Nottingham Forest in England and Olympiakos in Greece. The other two are also media owners, football owners, etc. My point is again about silence. We were able to publish, like Lara said, to publish a story based on open data, on data that was there, that you just had to connect the dots, not some kind of deep investigating reporting and all that, to show and actually to provide evidence that those three people are, each one of them, connected to the Greek mafia, connected to people in Greece who are involved in a huge war of mafia gangs that has cost the lives to more than 30 people. We have had 30 murders in the last 10 to 15 years, all them mobsters, not bystanders, etc., one killing the other. But two of the main mafia bosses, we were able to show, and I'm not afraid to say that because we had the evidence, that there were connections between each one of them. My point about silence is we published this thing, and there is completely nothing. Nothing. I mean, we didn't have even the normal reproduction by other websites and blogs and Twitter, etc. There was absolutely nothing. So for me, and that's my big ending here, the problem is not slaps. The problem is not attacks. Of course, if they intimidate you, if they hurt you, if they kill you, it's of course it's a bigger problem than. But if they don't kill you, my point is, our biggest problem in journalism is silence.
So thank you for that, Nikolas. Last but very not least, we have Matt Kennard, previously of the CIJ, before he moved on to help set up Declassified UK, which is a plucky upstart in the British investigative scene that you might have heard of, which, as good journalists do, has made lots of enemies. Matt left Declassified UK a couple of weeks ago, but he comes to talk to us about some of the enemies he did make in the course of his work and about his attempts to prize information from the British Ministry of Defence and Cabinet Office. Matt.
Can I just get up some websites? It's connected to the internet, yeah?
I mean, I think to exit them up here.
I'll just do Google. Okay. Thanks very much. I actually just want to start just to follow on from what my colleague from Greece was saying about silence. I totally agree with that. For me, the work that we've done at Declassified, and even before that, I feel like the major way that our societies are propagandized is propaganda by omission. The fact that our media, the mainstream media, leaves out all the truths we need to have a tolerable understanding of how our society works and in whose interests. And a very good example of this recently, which is related to the theme of today, which is state repression of journalists, is this country is going through a crisis in press freedom. Just a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine who's one of the best independent journalists in Britain, called Asa Winstanley, who works for a website called Electronic Intifada. He's done all the important work on the Israel lobby's role within the UK. He was woken at his home at pre-dawn by 13 counter-terrorism police who raided his house, took all his electronic devices with all his journalistic materials on, and didn't charge him or arrest him. So apparently in this country, the police can just go into your house and take all your stuff without even charging you with a crime. A month before that, Sarah Wilkinson, another independent journalist who is very prominent on Twitter and social media, who updates about sends regular updates about the genocide in Gaza and the UK role in that. She had her house raided by, I think it was 15 police, counter-terrorism police, some of them in balaclavas. She was bundled into a police van. They raided her whole house, tipped over the urn with her mum's ashes onto the wall. She had to scrape it off, bundled her into a van, interrogated her for hours, and then charged her under the Terrorism Act, Section 12, which carries up to 14 years in prison. The month before that, Richard Medhurst, another independent journalist, British independent journalist, was detained at Heathrow Airport in solitary confinement for 23 hours. He's another prominent pro-Palestinian journalist who's covering the genocide in Gaza. He was detained, as I say, at Heathrow. He was charged under the same Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, which carries up to 14 years. So this is scary stuff. But for me, what's scarier is, and goes to what my Greek colleague was saying about silence, not one word has ever been written in a UK newspaper about any of those three occasions, those arrests, those raids. So if you consume the mainstream media in Britain, you do not know that our police, that our state is cracking down on independent journalists in the service of the Netanyahu regime, essentially, because it's not a coincidence these are all pro-Palestinian journalists. So, and this includes the newspapers we're meant to revere, like The Guardian. The Guardian's not published a single word about Richard Medhurst, Asa Winstanley, or Sarah Wilkinson. So these are scary times. For me, that's media silence is more scary than the raids and arrests themselves, because our public sphere is undefended by the media, but it's also undefended by most NGOs, which is why this institution, CIJ Logan Foundation, is so important, because even today, you can't get events like this. You can't get events where you have people like us talking about what's going on in journalism. It's people like to talk the talk about media freedom and press freedom, but when you actually do the work, you realize most institutions, which we can talk about this tomorrow actually, but through funding and other ways of controlling the discourse, they don't want to hear your story, and they don't want to know about independent journalists that are getting raided by police. But anyway, that's just to open up. So today I'm going to talk about, so we started Declassified in 2019, mainly because we believed there was very, very little critical reporting on the British security state, the UK military, the intelligence services, its corporations, even BAE Systems, BP. We got some of the biggest corporations in the world based here. And I mean, the mainstream media in the UK has been rubbish for quite a while, but The Guardian did perform a role for a long time as a kind of unique place where you could get information that really exposed state and corporate power in this country and globally. I mean, this was evidenced by WikiLeaks in 2010, which most of that stuff went out in The Guardian. Edward Snowden in 2013, hugely important investigative journalism. But in fact, the first article we wrote for Declassified was how The Guardian had been neutralized by the security state after the Edward Snowden revelations. I'll just get that up actually, because see, yeah. So this was the first ever story we did for Declassified, and it was based on documents we'd got from the D-Notice Committee, which is a committee run by the Ministry of Defence, which meets every 6 months at the Ministry of Defence with a small collection of journalists and basically decides what can and can't be published in the newspapers. It sounds like an attack on press freedom, and it is. And any self-respecting press corps would not accept it. But of course, the establishment journalists here are part of it. So we got hold of some of their meeting documents of these meetings that they were having at the MOD around the time of the Edward Snowden leaks. And it showed basically that they were extremely worried, as you might imagine, by The Guardian publishing the NSA and GCHQ secrets. And what it shows is, and it's a long article, but basically what those documents show is that they actively set out to make sure that The Guardian could not perform the role that I described it previously performed in Britain. Now, this became explicit when they entered The Guardian's offices, GCHQ officers entered The Guardian's offices and oversaw the destruction of the laptops with Snowden documents on it with Guardian journalists, which again doesn't sound like something that would happen in a democracy. You can imagine it might happen in Saudi Arabia or China or somewhere, but this was in London. Again, The Guardian didn't reveal that at the time, they revealed it later. But what the document showed is that the DNOS committee basically manipulated The Guardian into becoming part of their team, essentially. So one of the main ways they did it, and these documents show, was that the deputy editor, Paul Johnson, who had been in the basement smashing up the laptops, was then appointed to the DNOS committee, which is this committee which is run by intelligence and British, and he served on it for 4 years afterwards. And in fact, there's quite a funny little quote at the end where it goes, so in 2018, when Paul Johnson, the deputy editor of The Guardian, who had been appointed in 2014, eventually left its chair, who was a MOD, the Ministry of Defence, praised Johnson, who he said had been instrumental in re-establishing links with The Guardian. So explicit, and that's the document there, you can see, look. Again, going back to the silence thing, none of this was ever reported. In fact, nothing we ever did at Declassified was ever reported in the mainstream. So this was a start, and then we carried on in this vein of trying to expose what the security state was doing. And then what happened was, at one stage, we got some documents which showed that the MI5 and MI6 were, we used to publish on this website in South Africa, so you can see it on this one. But so we got documents showing MI5 and MI6 were training spies from the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia at a base just outside London. And this was when our first real clash with the Ministry of Defence began, because I was trying to get comment from the Ministry of Defence, because the course that MI5 and MI6 were teaching these spies from these horrific dictatorships on was run by the Ministry of Defence. So I called them, as I always did, for story to get comment. And they said, okay, we'll get back to you. We'll send you some comment, which they had done previously. But they never replied. And then I call up the following day, they never replied. I call up the following day, they never replied. And then so that this story never had a comment, said after repeated requests. And then what happened was, there was at this stage with Declassified, before the Gaza genocide, which we've been working on for a year and exposing the UK role in that. Before that, though, our main topic that we were covering was the UK role in the war in Yemen, which was a horrific war led by Saudi Arabia, but essentially was with the US and the UK. And in fact, maybe the UK led over the US in terms of backing it. But at one stage, a soldier called Ahmed al-Batati, who again, everyone should know his name, but no one does. He was a young active duty soldier in the UK military. He did a protest in his fatigues outside the Ministry of Defence and blew a whistle every minute to signify how many people were dying in Yemen because of the UK. Well, they're not just UK backed. The UK were participating in that war, and he was arrested by the military police, taken into the Ministry of Defence, and then my colleague Phil Miller was trying to get a comment. This was soon after we published this MI5, MI6 story. My colleague Phil was trying to get a comment from the Ministry of Defence again, and he wasn't able to get a comment. They kept on saying the same thing to him, which was, we'll get back to you, and then they weren't getting back to him. And then finally he called them, and the guy on the other end of the phone, we found out was a senior military officer, said, "Oh, sorry, we're not going to send you anything because we no longer deal with your publication." And Phil, being a diligent reporter, was recording the call. So, and they probably thought we were small at that point. We're still small, but at that stage it was just three of us. So they probably thought, "Oh, no, it doesn't matter. No one's going to care." And they could also usually trust the mainstream media not to cover anything. So it was probably a fair enough assumption. But because we publicised the fact that that was a admission that they had blacklisted us, that they don't deal with us, which is a violation of the Civil Service Code and is unlawful, actually. But we publicized that, and then that was our only foray into the mainstream at that point, because it did get covered by a few people, and the Council of Europe sent out a level 2 media freedom alert, which meant the UK government had to respond. And eventually it became a bit of a scandal for the Ministry of Defence. The Secretary of Defence had to order an independent inquiry, which was done by Tony Blair's former spokesman, actually. And I'll get it up, actually. So it's a pretty amazing document, because it goes through it all, and it shows that the head of the communications directorate essentially said that we were a hostile media organisation and that they shouldn't deal with us anymore. Funnily enough, because they knew it was unlawful, when they had to apologise to us, which Ben Wallace did in the House of Parliament, he said it wasn't a policy of blacklisting, but it might have appeared so, which was just a way of getting out. I mean, it's worth reading this document. And basically, the guy says that we should put them on a list of people not to deal with. And what it shows is that they are used to dealing with a press corps which basically just regurgitate their propaganda. Anyone who was doing stories which you're told is what journalism should be, which was exposing the truth about what these people were doing and supporting this horrific war in Yemen, they just say they're hostile. And we were hostile, because you should be hostile to power. That's your role as a journalist. And again, to go back to the silence point, propaganda by omission. And this even shocked me, because I know all about propaganda by omission, but I thought the fact that this report had been done by Tony Blair's former spokesman, ordered by the Defence Secretary, published on the government's website, might interest the mainstream media here. Not a single word about this report has ever been in the UK mainstream media. Not one newspaper has ever written a single word. So again, no one even knows that there was this repression of declassified UKs. It's amazing. And that is how they brainwash the public, essentially, because people don't know this stuff is happening. But and then subsequent to this, there's plenty more, so I'll just quickly run through some of it. GCHQ, which is the largest UK intelligence agency by quite a distance, it's bigger than MI5 and MI6. I got some documents showing they were infiltrating British schools, and alongside arms corporations like Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, and Raytheon, and even doing things like speed dating with kids and arms companies in primary schools. So horrific stuff. And eventually, I was talking to them, and they wouldn't engage really. So I ended up actually, let me just have a look at this. So again, I ended up getting blacklisted by them too. And the reason I knew that was because when they stopped replying to me, I was like, well, I need to find out what's going on here. So I used the subject access request, which is European legislation, actually, which is where you can demand data that any organization has on you. And it's even applicable to intelligence agencies, which is one of the only transparency mechanisms in this country that does apply to them. In fact, MI5 and MI6 make it impossible to submit one, so I was never able to. With GCHQ, to be fair to them, I was able to submit one. But yeah, so what you can see in the bullets, they say, they wouldn't give me access to the schools, or they wouldn't tell me anything about the program. So I ended up just driving to Cheltenham, which is where they're based, and going to the schools that were the lead in the program and turning up there. And I did actually interview the head. He said off the record, but in these emails that I got from GCHQ around the time when I was trying to get this information, you can see they say, we're not engaging with him. And then one of the emails, the headline of it is, watch out, there's a journo about. This is GCHQ. They might even, I think we put look here, subject, watch out. A lot of it's redacted. I think this journal, and we don't know really, because this is the only bit of GCHQ that they told us. This is like the press office. And then I need to run through this quickly because there's so much of it, and we pissed off so many different departments. But another one, so this was a really interesting one for me as well, was in, let me have a look at this. I got documents from the UK Foreign Office so this is ones that they actually revealed themselves. 2021, they sent me a whole raft of documents around UK programs that were happening during the 2019 coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, which was a horrific event when he won an election, and it was made controversial by the OAS in Washington, and then the CIA and and MI6 probably, but we don't talk about it. But the Foreign Office basically worked on trying to oust Evo Morales. Funnily enough, it was one of the most interesting and hopeful stories outside of my story, but because the following year in 2020, democracy was restored in Bolivia and his former economy minister was re-elected president. So I think it's the only occasion I know of a CIA coup in Latin America being reversed the following year, and he's still in power. But anyway, so I published this story in 2021, and it went insane in Bolivia, mad, like on the front pages of all the papers. The ambassador was called in by the foreign minister, and they demanded that he made a report. It was all over the video, TV, and all sorts of stuff like that. And then so in that context, we let me just see. In that context, we did a follow-up story, obviously, about the ambassador himself. And then we started looking into what the ambassador was doing, and that was the British ambassador. Yeah. And we found he played a key role in the coup itself, including including hosting at the UK embassy one of the people who was involved. So this is where it gets interesting about the repression. They released a statement, the UK embassy. Again, this is interesting. Not a word about this has ever appeared in the UK media. So you're talking about a major diplomatic incident where the ambassador was threatened to get kicked out. The whole country knows about the UK ambassador. The whole country knows about the UK role in the coup, and yet not one word, including in the Guardian, has ever appeared in the UK. So it's a whole silent world that you're not allowed to know about. But anyway, the Foreign Office the UK embassy released a document, a statement, basically attacking Declassified UK, say this is a campaign of disinformation, which is bullshit, basically, which it wasn't. It was based on their documents, and in that statement, they didn't say one thing we got wrong, and we've never corrected anything. There was nothing wrong with any of it. But what was scary about it, or what is that if you look at UK military strategy documents, they've moved into what they call the grey zone now, which is this area of warfare which is about information warfare. So if you're an agent of disinformation, which is what they were accusing of, then they can activate military and intelligence agencies against you, which is why we contacted lawyers and said, can you please take it down? Because this is a real threat to us personally. Obviously, they didn't take it down. But we don't know what was being done behind the scenes, but essentially it showed how terrified they are of proper journalism, because they've never had to ever really go up against an organization which wants to expose their role in the world, their real role, because I mean, this completely blows out the water all the propaganda we're fed about Britain is spreading freedom and democracy around the world, it's concerned with human rights. You see, as the original article showed, that it was all about lithium, essentially. There's got the second highest proven reserves of lithium in the world, Bolivia, and it was under the control of a democratic socialist, the first indigenous president of Bolivia ever, and they weren't happy about it. And that's the reality of how the world works and Britain's role within it. But you can't say that. So when you start actually doing the journalism, which is rigorous journalism, I used to work for the Financial Times, funny enough, and we always thought that Declassified should be on the Financial Times style of journalism, but without the propaganda and without the propaganda by omission. So, but they attacked us massively. And then I'll finish with this. This relates to the Gaza genocide as well, because nearly all the stories I've been doing over the past year have been about the UK base on Cyprus, which is called RAF Akrotiri. Not many people know, but when Cyprus became independent from Britain in 1960, we retained 3% of the island, and we turned them into massive military and intelligence installations. They have been used as the main international hub for the build-up of forces, spies, weapons for supplying Israel for its genocide in Gaza. And we've done loads and loads of work over the past year on that. In fact, caused a major diplomatic incident in Cyprus. There's been major demonstrations at the base RAF Akrotiri in Limassol, which is the second city next door. The president of Cyprus has had to make a comment. The president of Northern Cyprus has had to make a comment. The UK High Commissioner has had to make a comment. Again, not a word about it has ever appeared in the UK mainstream media. But I went there the year before the genocide started, and so I got on a plane and went there, and I drove to the base, and the first time I went there, the central bit of it's called Episcopi, and I turned up and I was like, oh, hi, I didn't tell them who I was. I just said I just want to interview. I'm a journalist, and they said, okay, we'll get someone down. And the military officer came down and he was like, okay, did you email the MOD in London? I was like, yeah, I did. They didn't get back to me. And he said, well, you should have followed up. And I was like, well, we had a bit of a run-in with the MOD before. And he said, oh, yeah, I know all about that. And I was like, well, I never told you who I was. So he knew I was coming. I don't know how, but he knew I was on my way. So I left. And then the following day, I went to Dekelia, which is the other base we have in the east, which is an intelligence site, also an NSA site. The guy who I spoke to said, oh, yeah, we've been expecting you. He was a lower grunt. He wasn't one of the senior ones. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He was like, and then basically they put out a sovereign base-wide alert that I was present there. So anyway, I'll finish there. But basically it just shows, look, what I've just run through, there's plenty more. The other slide I had was about the Cabinet Office. I did a request to the Cabinet Office about how much, if I could get data on myself from the Cabinet Office under Boris Johnson. And they said, oh, no, we've got so much, we can't give it to you. They said, we've got 1,900 mentions of you in an 18-month period. And most of it was before this stuff. And it's too much to go through, and it was an average of 4 times a day. And they said, it's probably related to all the articles you've been writing for Declassified. And I was like, I looked into it and I'd written 31 articles and it had one. Anyway, so what it shows is that the British state does not tolerate freedom of press. It does not tolerate actual adversarial journalism. And it's all the theories and the soft power techniques that they use to present their adherence to free press. It's all rubbish. And if you start pushing too hard, you understand it all evaporates and that they'll clamp down on you and that they'll try to make it as difficult as possible. And in the case of Asa, Sarah, and Richard, they'll arrest you and raid you. Okay.
Thanks, Matt. Now, I'm afraid we've run on a little bit, so we only have 7 minutes left for questions. I would urge you to talk to all of our 4 speakers immediately after this session or whenever you find them. But for the moment, we have a roving mic, and I would ask you to keep your questions as concise as possible so we can get through as many as we can in 7 minutes. Do I see any hands? First of all, yourself there.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks so much. It's amazing rundown of a number of very serious situations in the world. My question is there also, as well as silence, amnesia? The history of journalism is way longer than the 20th century, and particularly in the last 50 years. Something quite serious been happening, particularly in the UK. Over my lifespan in journalism, documentary, international stories particularly, have not been able to find any space, be they in theatre or across the broad range of artistic expression. We can go back and talk about Mouldergate, when the South Africans were in the UK, buying companies, including trying to buy The Observer. All of this has been around for a long time. Have we forgotten those things? Has there been a period of amnesia in our society?
Is there a kind of amnesia where we sort of unlearn or forget things from the past, and that's why we keep making mistakes, I suppose? Any answers to that? There doesn't have to be, because we're on a bit of a schedule here. Ariane, Nikolas, anything to say on that?
It's true that maybe history is not looked enough as material for journalism, investigative journalism, but we are more and more trying to do so. As Lara showed, at Disclose, we expose, for instance, nuclear tests in the French island, and it was based on a public document trials that were done in the 60s. And it exposed how much French didn't inform the people who were exposed to nuclear bombings and trials in this island. So, but it's a very it's difficult to investigate about the past sometimes more than about the present, because the sources are harder to find and it's longer to work on this material. So that's why we need to, I think, collaborate more also with university, with researchers, with journalists to dig into these kind of stories.
Lara, perhaps your investigation was historical.
Well, we don't necessarily have that same problem in Lebanon because we're constantly reliving the past. And if I want to talk about the Palestinians who are now reliving the Nakba on a much larger scale and much more devastating scale. So we fortunately don't suffer from amnesia, to the contrary.
Just wanted to add very interesting question in my view, and in the Greek context, amnesia is the real big word. For example, when you have the Greek debt crisis like 10, 15 years ago, and there was this immense coverage from all over the world in Greece, there was no context at all, there was no historical understanding of how it came about. We had just this kind of parachuting journalists landing on the country and not understanding anything. And amnesia is always a problem. We will discuss tomorrow about funding and independence and all that. And I'm thinking in Greece now you have to gigantic foundations spending billions in Greece. They are seen by everybody as a force of good. And we forget that 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, the Onassis and the Niarchos foundations were owned by Onassis and Niarchos. And if you go back into the the newspaper archives, it was all about their wrongdoing, about their corruption, about horrible stuff that they were doing. Then they died, then there was silence, and then they came back with their foundation spending billions, and everybody's so happy about them. So, of course, amnesia is very important.
I think we have time for one more question. It better be a good one. And it's got to be very, very concise.
I have a question for Ariane, a concise one. Were the sources that provided those leaked classified documents, were they ever, they searched your computers and your phones and things, did they ever find the leakers? And if they didn't, how did you protect them, given that they came and take all your equipment?
The thing is, in France, when you are not indicted, you don't have access to any file. A bit like the story you said, you are arrested, you're put in custody. So I don't know who they interrogated, if they collaborate with Egyptian intelligence forces and talk to people I talked to in Egypt. So there, it's totally blurred for me what they are doing, if I'm still taped, if my colleagues are still taped. I have no clue until I will be indicted eventually, and I will have access to my file. But the documental stuff that they took in my flat was pretty irrelevant. But still with the intention to breach sources. So the question we have to ask is less like, did they succeed in their operation or not? But was our story of a public interest, and did we deserve such a crackdown?
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this session. I would urge you to connect with all four of our speakers if you want to continue the conversation. I just want to thank Lara, Nikolas, Ariane, and Matt for neatly illustrating what we can achieve as investigative journalists and the forces that are railed against us. Thank you all.